going to share some tips now about our topic of conversation today, addressing school-related trauma. So please know that you're going to get a tip sheet after this that has all of these things that I'm saying. So no need to take notes. You can just sit back and listen. So first, we can start by thinking about what school-related trauma means. So traumatic events often happen once, such as a fatal accident in the community. There might also be school violence that contributes to school-related trauma. There are also societal and systemic issues like racism, sexism, the global pandemic that we just experienced, or an economic recession that can contribute to school-related trauma. And then there's also trauma that's specific to an individual school building that might be perpetuated by the culture of a school or a district that's not supportive and inclusive of all of the individuals and their differences in ability, race, gender, or sexual identity. So that can happen to any individual in the school or some populations within the school. And then there are also individual traumas that happen either to a single person or a collective group that specific students or staff members are navigating in their personal life. That might be a loss in their family, a divorce, a financial instability, or an abuse that's happening personally in their life, but that they bring into the school that can be exacerbated if the adults in the school don't understand how to respond compassionately with trauma-informed practices. So one way that we as a school community can start to address this school-related trauma is to reflect on our school's history through that trauma-conscious lens. So thinking about the time that you have spent as a parent of a child at your school, your child's school, or perhaps if you went to that same school, your own career as a student there, and thinking about any tragedies that might have occurred in the school building or in your community, and thinking about how well the school responded to that crisis, if there was any follow-up after the fact, if they were able to honor those that were survived or lost in the tragedy, and how the community came in and supported the school's needs. And if you see some gaps in how the school responded, perhaps starting a dialogue about how to remedy those things. There are also, as I said, societal events that might affect the way that students experience school, and maybe having your school publicly acknowledge events like this. For example, although we think of American schools as being desegregated, the last US school to formally end segregation happened in 2016. So there are a lot of contemporary students and parents who experienced racism directly in school, contributing to school-related trauma. We can also get involved as a parent in the way that our schools respond to mental health crises. We can ask about our school mental health support systems and see if the practices that they're using build resilience for students before a tragedy begins. So does your school have universal programming for building social emotional skills? And if they don't, perhaps offering some resources, which we'll have in the tip sheet, for programs that they could try. Early intervention programs are really important. Those can include just teaching students, staff, and family members about mental health, how to speak about it without causing stigma, how to identify symptoms of mental health challenges. A really popular program is called Youth Mental Health First Aid, and it's a free program that anyone can sign up for to learn how to help young people recognize and address their mental health challenges. Schools can also post phone numbers and websites like the National Suicide Prevention Line or a crisis text line, so that when students are in crisis, they know where to turn. Parent-teacher organizations can work together with schools to look at some of the specific things in the school building that might contribute to trauma, such as unsafe building conditions, whether there's abusive language being used from students or teachers or other staff member, how to create a culture of acceptance and inclusion together as parents and school staff. And also making sure that staff and families understand de-escalation techniques. So understanding how when a child is triggered by their trauma, they can get compassionate responses that help reduce that emotional response rather than exacerbating it. Other things that the school and the parent teacher organization can do together include addressing community or family situations that cause individual students to experience trauma. Things like homelessness, poor nutrition, domestic violence, incarceration, or death of a family member, separation from a family member, immigration, living with a person who misuses substances, or living in a home where abuse and neglect are actively occurring. So, providing resources for individual students and families to get the help they need for all of those situations. You can also help improve your own listening skills to create environments where youth feel safe. So, understanding how to use active and reflective listening with your children when you're trying to debrief about any kind of traumatic events that they might have experienced, and asking school administrators if staff have also been trained in these skills. And active and reflective listening involves making eye contact, allowing each person to have the mic and completely explain their point of view without interruption, and reflecting back what you believe they've said so that you're both on the same page in the conversation. You can also, as a parent or a member of a family, and as a school staff member, use motivational interviewing techniques. And I've got a link in there in the tip sheet, which goes through some of those techniques. They are much better at helping youth who express noncompliance find a goal that they want to work towards than using yelling, coercing, or nagging, which are not so effective. So, helping staff and you yourself using those techniques when you're trying to help children learn new skills and meet their goals. It's also important to create safe environments with nurturing adults, both in the home and in the schools. And we've partnered before with Life is Good Playmakers, which is a great nonprofit organization that teaches adults specific ways of being with children to help build resilience and create a sense of safety. It's also important for you as a family member to educate yourself about the concept of intergenerational trauma and how trauma that grandparents and parents have experienced can be passed down to children. You can look into the concept of neurobiology of trauma. We at the C-TLC have some resources on our website about that, and to understand how trauma affects the body, the mind, and our behaviors. And you can ask school staff if, or school administration, if staff have been trained in these things as well. We can also encourage leadership to help staff have discussions about how staff trauma history influences the way that they interact with others in the school building. Whenever a tragedy does happen in the school or the community, it's important to engage in conversations that involve staff, families, and students so that we have that shared goal of healing together. The Courageous Conversations framework is one that we've recommended a lot. It was originally developed to help schools start conversations about equity, but the tools and strategies are useful for conversations about any difficult topic. It can be helpful to invite outside facilitators in for these challenging conversations so that there's a neutral party. And remembering to use those active and reflective listening skills during these difficult conversations to avoid blaming and shaming and allowing everyone to share their feelings. Starting and ending conversations like these with a mindfulness practice can help us all release a little stress and be able to come into a similar mindset to be able to open up to each other. And whenever we do have these conversations that are difficult and talk about trauma, it's important for school staff to have resources available for folks who are triggered during these conversations. So having school mental health professionals or professionals from the community available during the conversations, and also having a curated list of mental health resources, maybe articles, support groups, or contact information for therapists so that you can pass out in case anyone needs a little extra help. Another way to reduce trauma at school is to give ample opportunities for feedback, both from students and families, so that their voices are able to be heard, but also that policies and procedures that are harmful to students and families are brought into the light and can be analyzed and perhaps changed. School staff should have a variety of methods for this. They can be online, in person, on the phone, maybe formal surveys or conversations, social media posts where folks are able to comment. And we can also make sure to bring in outside community organizations to build partnerships to address some of the needs that are brought up, because we know that schools are asked to fill a lot of roles and not all of them are their expertise. So it's important to bring in folks who understand how best to meet the needs of students and families and staff members uh, whenever challenges arise. When schools use more transparency, it can be really helpful to families. And I see, Deborah, you raised your hand. We're going to get to the conversation in about 3 minutes, and we'll call on you first. Having more transparency can decrease the amount of trauma that families and students feel when they are part of the conversation and understand what's going on and why decisions are being made. For parents, it can be important to understand the role of trauma in your child's school experience. And I've got a variety of resources, including 3 different books that you can look into to read more about how trauma directly affects a child's ability to learn in the school setting. Some really great practices that schools can use to be trauma responsive. Instead of using punitive disciplinary practices and exclusionary discipline practices, such as detention and expulsion and suspension, which separate children from the school community, they can use restorative justice practices that bring students together and help get at the root cause of behaviors rather than just the symptoms. So I have some resources linked in the tip sheet that you could share with your school administrators about restorative practices, including the benefits of them, and some information about how zero tolerance policies and school resource officers can sometimes exacerbate trauma within the school building rather than reducing violence. And we can use these restorative practices within our own homes too, when siblings have conflict, sitting them down and allowing them to use those active and reflective listening skills to get their sides of the story out and really get at the root cause of why a conflict happened rather than focusing on consequences. We've got a lot of resources on the tip sheet as well about how to help students address grief and loss, which will be really important as we go back to school in the fall. It's really important that schools not jump right into academics, but allow time for healing after this really difficult school year.